Yeah, we're back. We're here for part two of our ongoing talking through censorship, right? And so, if you tuned in last time, we talked about kind of the historical antecedents to our current era of censorship question mark. So we talked through the Adams administration, Alien and Sedition Acts. We mentioned the gag order. We talked through the kind of the reemergence of the Sedition Act during World War One and the first Red Scare, and we ended with the Palmer raids, kind of these iconic and destructive federal raids in 1920 that were aimed nominally at targeting radical leftists, but really ended up being just kind of a dragnet for um, immigrants of the time that they were after and wanted to kind of dissuade or deport. And so there's a long history of censorship in the U.S. That was part one. Part two, we're going to talk about where censorship overlaps with another phenomenon of our era here, which uh, is ignominiously known as cancel culture. Um, we're going to talk about whether or not those two things are the same. Maybe we'll even debate it because I think we'll see whether Josh and I have similar definitions that way. But thanks for tuning in again for part two. I'd encourage you to look back at part one if you haven't wrestled with that one yet, especially if you're a history buff and want to know about the kind of longer term history of censorship. Um, but to start us off today, thinking through this kind of cancel culture, censorship thing, is all censorship cancel culture? Is cancel culture a part of censorship, or are they two different things? Um, I've got a quote here. Okay, so this is an article from Robert Post. The article is called "Censorship and Silencing." It's kind of looking at this cultural phenomenon, um, and he's using different kind of theorists and academics to try to make sense of cancel culture and censorship in our current society, and he says, right, that we have begun to perceive power as dispersed, not just top down, I would add, right, but as circulating, as spinning out from the enactment of discursive and disciplinary practices. That's a lot of fancy academic words. What do you make of that, Josh, in terms of how the power of censorship and how that fits within our kind of current society, um, its relationship to cancel culture? Um, what do you think?
Well, first of all, that was an awesome word pull with dragnet. I haven't heard that word maybe ever in a semi-professional setting. That's my way of avoiding talking about Foucault for another 10 seconds. Yeah, I mean, like that quote from Robert Post is talking about Foucault, who's this French intellectual in the.
Sorry, did I not name drop him when I read the
You
quote?
somehow managed to avoid it, I think. Jeez, look at that. I tried to pawn it off on you, and here you are. It, like anyone who's been in grad school has nightmares about Foucault because he's like the densest, most difficult to understand scholar maybe ever,
Yeah.
definitely ever. But the main
The
premise
premise, yeah.
is that at least with censorship, traditional debates about censorship have been it's this thing from the top down imposed by the state and received by like the citizens. Foucault's work in a number of different ways argues and posits that power certainly can be imposed by the state, but power also kind of permeates through society at a more person to person level.
Mm-hmm.
And as Post says, power is more dispersed, it circulates, it spins out from the enactment of discursive and disciplinary practices. So in you and me talking, you know, maybe you start saying something that I think is a little out of line. I might push
Yeah.
back, and that might be a form of censorship. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, a very different definition of censorship than something like the Alien and Sedition Acts, but
Right.
censorship nevertheless. Um, and I mean, we see certainly example after example of state imposed censorship throughout American history. That's what we talked about in part one.
Yeah.
You also see throughout American history examples of more societal censorship. I mean, you of all people could wax poetic about the Puritans and their moral misgivings about a lot of what goes on in the world.
Sure.
We have entire cities, Atlantic City, Las Vegas, founded purely as like anti-Puritan places. So America is ground zero for discussing self-censorship of its own people.
Uh-huh.
But within the culture industries, the Hollywood, the Hays Code from 1930 to 1968, that's a self-imposed code coming out of the Hollywood studios. Um,
Yeah.
you have parental advisory labels put on CDs when CDs were still a thing, uh, to kind of regulate and warn people about excessive language or profanities or whatever. Um, when it comes to society itself, I have a quote from Thoreau um, that I'll throw back at you and you can pick it up. The quote is from March 2nd, 1858, in the publication Spring. So Thoreau says, "There is no need of a law to check the license of the press. It is law enough and more than enough to itself. Virtually, the community must have come together and agreed to what things shall be uttered, have agreed on a platform, and to excommunicate him who departs from it. And no one in 1,000 dares utter anything else."
Hmm. Yeah. So he's basically saying there, right, that like people, you don't actually need, you don't need a law policing speech in the press or something like that, because people themselves as a collective will control what gets printed in the newspapers, right? If a newspaper starts printing something so foul that it enrages people, they're going to either A, stop subscribing to that newspaper and, in a capitalist sense, force it out of the market, right? Or in a even kind of more societal sense, the pressure is too strong that a newspaper is not going to print something in the first place that's going to make 99 out of 100 people furious at it, just because it doesn't make sense. So I think Thoreau is subscribing to this kind of idea that, through a kind of a democratization of American society, at least, there will be some censorship of the people by the people, right? Um, and that's where something like cancel culture, I think, comes in, right? Because the and I've been a critic of certain cancel culture things over the years. I think a critic of cancel culture would say that it is just mob mentality for the 21st century. And I think what someone like Thoreau or Foucault would say is that mob mentality is okay sometimes, right? Like that is the democratization of power in policing speech, right? So it's not just a top down king or tyrant saying you can't say this, right? But sometimes, at least in a democratic society like ours, it is the people saying you can say it, but if you say it, we're all going to shun you, or we're all going to cancel you, right? Or we're all going to unsubscribe from your Twitter feed or your newspaper or your social media accounts or whatever. And in that way, cancel culture is not very new, right? That is as old as, well, it's as old as American society. It's probably as old as human society in a certain sense. But, you know, cancel culture, I mean, the critique is that this is some new woke phenomenon that people, get out of line and they say the wrong thing, and then all of a sudden, their life is over because people ignore them or block them on social media or whatever. The reality is that those consequences have always been baked into society. I mean, you know, I think back to like the Stamp Act crisis, right? The kind of the very early lead ups to the American Revolution, and like tax collectors that agreed to administer the Stamp uh, Act, they were physically threatened. Some cases they were tarred and feathered, and these were not like British officials from London. These are like, your neighbor in Boston that just needed a good state job administering the stamp tax. All of a sudden, people aren't speaking to them in church, and people are threatening to tear down their houses and tar and feather them every weekend. So, I think that there are elements of cancel culture all the way through American society. But I don't know. What do you think of cancel culture, Josh? Is it censorship, or is it
Yeah,
acceptable censorship? I mean,
yes, I think it's censorship, and I think it's necessary censorship, and I don't think all censorship is bad. I mean, it in some ways, like, we can have a nuanced conversation. Like, I think it's our civic duty to like call out um, egregious examples of hate speech or
yeah.
misogynistic speech or whatever the case may be. Um, I mean, it does get uncomfortable. I think academics like to talk about how the prison system doesn't align itself with the question of rehabilitation quite enough. And you could say that maybe this mob mentality doesn't quite have rehabilitation in mind when it wants to just cancel someone and forget about them for the rest of their lives. I think the biggest critique maybe is that there's not enough distinction made between an old tweet that someone had from 15 years ago and someone like Kevin Spacey or someone like Harvey Weinstein who have decades of systemic sexual abuse. Like,
Yeah, well,
those two
I was
things
going
are
to say
very
those are
different.
very different. Yeah.
Yeah, and so we need to be careful about like not lumping anyone who's been quote unquote canceled into the same bin, because there's a lot of different bins and there are different tiers. Some criminal, some just distasteful. But by and large, yes, I think we as a society have a civic duty to sort of self censor ourselves and what we say, and what's okay to say and what's out of bounds. And like everyone knows, like, when you're joking. Um, there's a certain level of disingenuousness, I think, with a lot of the jokes today told by people on the right, where the joking is almost a shield to actually promulgate like hate speech, right?
Hmm.
And that's worth calling out, I think, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that.
Well, I also think there's this like victim card play that people who have been canceled do. And I'm not sure that any of them have actually suffered much from being canceled. Now, obviously, the egregious ones that have been canceled, the Kevin Spaceys, the Harvey Weinsteins, they should have been canceled, right? Like those people probably should be behind bars if they're not. And sexual assault is obviously a criminal thing. It's not someone misspeaking on Twitter, or having a off color quote in a yearbook or something. And the people that have had those things, like, yeah, maybe it's been tough for a few months or a year, but in so many of those cases, I see those commentators are rebounding from those supposed cancellations, right? They're back on such and such show, or they're back on the comedy circuit or whatever. So that fear of cancel culture that was alive and awake and very much kind of in the news, and probably, I don't know, 2020, or maybe during the Me Too thing. I think that a lot of that was just, um, there was a lot of smoke without a lot of fire, is what I'll say. And people still like to point back to that, and use it as a victimization thing, where they say, see, gotta watch what you say or you get canceled. It's like, well, if that were true, Donald Trump wouldn't be president.
Well, I think the victim mentality is exactly where I wanted to go. I would argue that cancel culture is one of the foundational elements on which the MAGA base presents itself as a clear and obvious fascist entity, right? Like, because the victim mentality is a core tenet of any
Okay.
fascist enterprise. And
Sure.
like the question is like, I've understood fascism to be the consolidation of the existing order. Like the existing order, whatever that is under siege in some capacity. And
Mm.
to be a fascist is to rally around the existing order and try to reconsolidate it and regain that power and then aggressively throw it back out. So if we're going to talk about cancel culture, like what is the existing order being challenged? It's it's a couple things. It's broadly speaking the patriarchy, but like the idea that like men should traditionally hold positions of power
Mm.
in these fields of work, whether it's Hollywood or the government or the home. Um, it's we see white supremacy being challenged by Black Lives Matter around the same time
Mm-hmm.
as the Me Too movement. Um, and
Christian
so
nationalism, right? Like this idea that Christianity in America is under siege somehow, even though it's still the majority. Um, those kinds of things, right?
and it's under siege by other religions like radical Islamists, right, who are all trying to blow us up allegedly. But I think MAGA, we see, plays the victim of these movements. Donald Trump's rhetoric is always about these movements more than
Victimhood.
any policy that he's proposing. Um, the final thing to mention, like to bring it around, like to me, fascism is a presentation of you're under siege, but the reality of it is that your action
You're actually perpetrating what you're accusing other people of.
exactly. And so within the second Trump administration, what do we see? We see an attack on the success of the Me Too movement directly with a a month long, now going on year long cover up of the worst sexual abuses committed in the modern world. Um, we see an aggressive push against the success of Black Lives Matter and this effort to kind of crack into the white supremacist model of American history and of America itself with major ICE raids and crackdowns on people of color predominantly.
And even the retelling of those stories, right? So, like, you're taking down, these are small things, but they add up, right? You're taking down, um, in Philadelphia, placards explaining slavery in the context of early America, because you want to retell that story. You're highlighting places across the National Park Service where the U.S. government is not viewed in a positive light because of violence against Native people, or because of slavery, or because of kind of these racial policies. And you're removing all that stuff. So you're trying to reclaim that history. You're even rewriting stuff like January 6th, in official government capacities on websites and at the Smithsonian and things like that, right? So it's like a clawing back of power, clawing back, and a I guess a hijacking of these kind of stories, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Me Too, or these kind of longer term stories of American history.
Which is one of the reasons why academics are such a source of ire for Trump and for MAGA. And you
Sure.
see
Yeah.
institutions like the Heritage Foundation trying to advocate for a more quote unquote traditional view of American history that recenters, the great white men who built this country and not, the slaves, for example, or the people that historians have been concerned about for the last 50, 60 years in the fields.
Right. So it's a critique of quote unquote DEI within American history or whatever, right? And the irony here, right, and this brings us back to the censorship thing and cancel culture, is that now we're seeing almost like a role reversal in so many things, right? The accusation actually becomes the admission of guilt, where you've got people in power, in this case, kind of Trump and Trump's allies, right wing folks, um, leveraging and canceling out people that disagree with them or that criticize them or that seem not patriotic enough, right? And that takes many forms, right? In some cases, that looks like, um, direct critiques of Trump or Trump's administration. In other cases, it's, labeled as anti-Semitic or whatever. But I think in all of those cases, you see a crackdown on free speech, and a new approach to cancel culture that's coming from the right, not the left. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the approach coming from the right with quote unquote cancel culture is just state imposed censorship, right? I mean, we're back to the much more traditional. Yeah, this is the federal government saying this. Okay.
Saying you can't talk about this, or